When families gather for the holidays, fun activities are often planned to make core memories together. The Jones family decided to go caving at Nutty Putty, but they had no idea of the devastating loss their family would suffer. This is the fatal breakdown of the Nutty Putty Cave tragedy. John Jones was ready for some family fun when they decided to explore the Nutty Putty Cave in the Utah desert near Salt Lake City. He had not been to this particular cave before, but he and his brother Josh had spent much of their youth caving in a variety of Utah caves. He considered himself to be an experienced caver, though his exploring had slowed down in recent years. He had gotten married, had a child, and was currently a medical student at University of Virginia. This made for a busy regular schedule, which left little time for cave exploring. During the Thanksgiving break, he was returning home to relax with family for the holiday. They planned a day of hiking and exploring at Nutty Putty, which is considered a beginner's cave by most. The main areas of the cave were interesting for everyone. There was the maze room, which had openings and tunnels leading around large boulders. There was a large ramped area called the slide, where the entire room sloped down at a 45-degree angle with a rope to guide you down. This cave system was well mapped in most of the traversable areas. There were also well-known areas that were more challenging, like the birth canal or the aorta crawl. These areas were tight and difficult to pass, so only more experienced cavers would be attempting to squeeze through these passages. Even with the known challenges, people still found themselves stuck in tight squeezes in these tunnels. Nutty Putty had just recently been opened back up to the public, after being closed for several years because of cavers getting stuck in these difficult squeezes. They were passable for some, but others would find that their shoulders or hips would just not pass, no matter how hard they pulled against the rock. After wedging themselves in the narrow space, they were completely stuck, requiring serious assistance to inch out backwards. Because of these rescues, a new permit-style entry was required, listing 2 experienced cavers per group. Josh had obtained a permit for a group to explore the Tuesday before Thanksgiving, November 24, 2009. John's pregnant wife Emily stayed back at the house with their 1-year-old daughter Lizzie to enjoy a more relaxing evening with the in-laws. Their group of 11 family and friends started off in the main open cave sections. Eventually, John and his brother Josh took 2 friends off to find more challenging tunnels to try. They had heard stories about the birth canal and consulted the map for its location. It was known to be a long, tight passage with a particularly tight squeeze near the end. If you could just get past the narrowest part, there would be a small room at the end to stand up and turn around. They knew that the birth canal would be tight and could be panic-inducing, even for experienced cavers. They spread out to try to find this particular tunnel. John and Josh took the passage on the left, moving through a small tunnel for around 15 feet. It undulated up and down in several elevations over the next 10 feet. There were outcroppings of rocks and tight squeezes that required a caver to twist their body in several orientations to get shoulders past, then hips, and finally twisting legs so that they bend in the proper direction. It was not a matter of simply pulling your body forcefully through a tight hole. This area was called the corkscrew because the few who had been through it were small and flexible, using all their skills to maneuver slowly through the panic-inducing contortions. After the corkscrew area, the passage angles up for another 5 feet or so, then turns down over a rock ledge with a sharp 90-degree bend to the left. Up until now, cavers had used this small area after the corkscrew to turn back on themselves if needed, and head back through the difficult section. 5 years before, a 16-year-old boy named Brock Clark was stuck in this corkscrew section. He was only 5 foot 7 inches tall and weighed 140 pounds, but got wedged when he was trying to turn around. It took 14 hours for rescuers to free him. John was in the exact spot where Brock got stuck trying to turn around. Since John was 6 feet tall and 200 pounds, he clearly knew that turning around in this part of the tunnel was not an option for him. He was in a 12-inch high space, with not enough lateral area for his pressed body to ball up for a turn. He pushed forward to the ledge area and squeezed over the top of it. It was a tight area to get through, but he thought he could see it open up down below. He sucked in his stomach and pressed himself through the squeeze, pulling forward on the rocks in front of him. He would be moving headfirst in a downwards angle now, but it looked like there was an area ahead to turn around. John didn't know it, but no one else had ever crossed over this ledge before. He was in completely uncharted territory. Despite being in an extremely tight and uncomfortable position, John kept his cool. He was certain that there would be an opening ahead. All along he thought he was in some part of the birth canal, where many cavers had felt stuck in the constricting tunnel, but ended up being just fine once they reached the other side. Once he passed through a tight zone, he started to slide toward the bottom of this tunnel. He was nearly doing a handstand, trying to hold his body up and figure out how to push backwards. He still couldn't turn, and now he was upside down. Gravity was pulling his 200-pound body against the fading strength of his arms. He yelled out to his brother Josh and told him not to follow him, but to go back out. They discussed his options and decided that moving forward to try to turn around was the best idea. He was collapsing onto his shoulders and head at this point, and needed to make a move to get out of this vertical position. His headlamp gave him a glimpse of a hole in the floor ahead, which might lead to a larger space. He felt a little more hopeful now, thinking that they would be laughing about this misadventure over Thanksgiving dinner. He made the slight turn and headed towards the hole. Exactly how he got himself into this tunnel hole is unknown. It's thought that he may have slipped, hit his head, and became wedged in the tight space. The other thought was that he looked in the hole, but misjudged what he saw, thinking it was an opening and not simply a dead-end fissure. Either way, John had ended up in a small opening in the bottom of this tunnel, which was impossibly narrow. Just 18 inches by 10 inches, not much bigger than the screen of a laptop computer. John found himself wedged nearly completely upside down at a 70-degree angle. He had spent some time trying to push himself back upwards out of this hole. It was exhausting. His arms were pinned in a useless position, one folded under his chest and the other trapped on a rock down by his side. He strained against the walls and quickly realized that all of his effort would not move him back up 5 feet to the shallow tunnel. His calves and feet were still free up in the passage, but his legs were now wedged on the smallest side of the hole, only 8 inches wide. He started yelling for Josh again. His brother knew that he was trying to turn around, so his yells were not a good sign. Josh made his way back into this tight space and traversed the corkscrew path. But unlike his brother, he went feet first this time. He continued toward the sound of John's voice, up over the ledge. He finally came to an alarming sight. He could see the end of his brother's legs sticking out of the rock, as if it had swallowed him whole. He inched forward until his feet could squeeze one of John's legs. He tried to grip and pull up, while John pushed from his end. After several futile attempts, they were both feeling exhausted and frustrated. Josh could see that this was very serious, and they would need professional help to get him out. They agreed that Josh should go get help, and John should try, as much as possible, to stay calm and relaxed. While Josh went for help, one of the other family friends went into the area to speak to John and let him know that he wasn't alone. For several hours, John just remained trapped upside down, focused mostly on the chore of breathing. The fissure squeezed his chest, where only shallow breaths were possible. All of his efforts to move up had actually settled him deeper into the crack. As time went on, gravity continued to pull him against the rough walls of the tunnel, tightening its grip on his exhausted body. Once help had arrived, the first cave rescuer, Susie Matola, made her way to where John was stuck. It was now 12:30 in the morning, and John had been upside down for 3 hours. Susie was just 5 feet 3 inches tall, so working her way through the corkscrew area was much easier for her. Ropes had been tied to her ankles as a precaution in case she got stuck as well. She checked on how John was doing and let him know that they'd be getting him out. He must have had a small wave of relief, thinking that professional help had arrived and he would soon be free of this trap. Susie tied webbing straps around his legs and then fed it back to the pit where the tunnel started. Several attempts were made to pull on the ropes to leverage John back up and out of the fissure. There was just too much friction on the ropes to make any effective release on John. He was still pinned, without the use of his arms to fully assist. After attempting a few things and considering many aggressive options, the decision was made to enlist a pulley system in order to help lift John up and out. A pulley had been successfully used when Brock Clark was stuck 5 years before. Even though they had a plan of how to help, this was not an easy location to work in. Each piece of equipment would need to be brought in from the entrance, which took nearly an hour to reach the other side of Corkscrew. The tunnel was extremely tight, and only smaller power tools could be carried in and out. Only one person could be in there to assist at a time, and they would need to be small or wiry to effectively move through the passage. It was just not an ideal situation. Each pulley took an extraordinary amount of time to install. During this time, cavers were trying to talk with John, console him, and share stories to keep him calm and talking. He was a devout Mormon, and spent time praying and singing to seek solace in this unreal situation. John had spent the night upside down and was showing signs of the physical limitations of the body to withstand this position. The human body was not made to be upside down for long. The entire circulatory system is designed using pulses of pressure from the heart to move blood forward through the system, while valves and fibrous vessels would hold blood and stop it from going backwards. This one-way flow balances pressure, gravity, and valves to keep oxygen available to all tissues and to remove toxins from the body through the kidneys. John's body had been fighting gravity for more than 12 hours. The brain was not built to withstand this kind of fluid pressure. Fluids were building up in his lungs, and toxins were starting to accumulate from the lack of proper circulation. His organs were pressing on his lungs, and each breath was an exhausting effort for muscles not built for such work. His breathing was slowing, and he was completely spent from the effort. Throughout the night, he had gone from being completely calm and lucid to helplessly thrashing his legs and hallucinating. It was excruciating to watch for the rescuers. They were helpless, exhausted, and feeling trapped themselves. The air in this cave system was warm and damp. It took a concerted effort to remain calmly breathing when you are restricted and can't move or even breathe properly. But the rescuers knew they could get out when needed. John didn't have that luxury. He couldn't expand his chest to breathe, and the air around him was losing its oxygen concentration little by little. During this time, a wired telecom system was brought down to where John was stuck. His wife spoke with him, encouraging him to hang on and be faithful. John assured her that he would be out with her soon. It wasn't until 4 o'clock that day that they finally got the pulleys in place to move him. Ryan Schertz was in the tunnel when the system was ready to try. John's body had settled into the narrow side of the opening, so Ryan had to push his legs over as the team pulled from outside. Each heave moved him inch by inch up out of the hole. By this time, John's legs were in excruciating pain. A rope had been tied around his legs for hours as rescuers tried various methods to help him out. They were completely blue and had no discernible pulse, yet each tug had him call out to stop as his nerves were ultra-sensitive at this point. They paused to give him a moment to gather himself, and then tried again. It seemed to be working. John was finally being pulled up out of this hole. He was raised enough for Ryan to look down to make actual eye contact with him and pass down a tube to drink Gatorade. This effort was extremely slow going, and they were all exhausted from the difficult effort. Ryan was squeezed in a tunnel just 12 inches high and had his head near John's legs as they worked him slowly out of the tight 10-inch fissure. Although they were making some progress in lifting him up, they were no closer to getting him out. His legs were hitting the low ceiling above his tunnel, and twisting them into the passage was impossible. He had no control over his legs now, after 19 hours upside down. Without his help to delicately bend his knees to the side, they were strongly considering breaking his legs to get him back into the passage, because time was running out for John. Then, in a sudden moment of blinding pain, Ryan blacked out. When he came to, he was bleeding heavily and confused. The rope, holding the pulley to a natural arch section in the cave, broke and whipped the carabiner and pulley directly into Ryan's face. He suffered damage to his face, lip, and tongue, as well as a concussion. He had to get out of there quickly. John was back where he started, completely wedged in the tunnel with the circulation to his arms cut off and his legs completely dead. He was unable to help free himself in any way. This moment started the final demise of John Jones. After Ryan was checked out in the pit and then sent off to the hospital, his father Dave took his place in the passage with John. It took an hour to re-establish the pulley lines, and Dave tried to tie a rope around John's body, but couldn't get the rope past his wedged torso. All the time Dave was with John, he was not responsive. This entire operation required John's help to effectively rescue him. There was no way to lift his 200-pound, 6-foot frame without him pushing and trying to leverage himself in some way. In Dave's effort to tie up John, he got himself stuck for about 15 minutes. Their desperate effort to help save this man had put both his son and himself in danger. It was a devastating reality. Once he had pushed himself back into the 12-inch tunnel, he was exhausted and had to leave. Brandon Kowalis took his place and brought in the telecom system so John's family could talk to him. His wife Emily expressed her love and told him to take a break and rest after all of his effort. She still truly believed he would be coming out, but Brandon could see what she could not. John was no longer responsive, and no signs of life could be heard. Over the previous several hours, Ryan reported the gurgling breaths that John was struggling with. Now, there was silence. The rescue team gathered in the pit area inside the cave and discussed the situation. It was determined that a medical professional would need to confirm that he had actually passed. A paramedic was sent into the tight section to confirm what was suspected. At 11:56 on Wednesday, November 25th, John Jones was pronounced dead. The rescue teams worked for 24 hours straight to try to free John, but it was just not possible with his upside-down position. The clock was ticking, and he just ran out of time. John survived an extraordinary 27 hours in an inverted position, which is 3 times longer than what was predicted as possible. The 6 rescue personnel who actually reached John in that rocky prison were truly heroic. They willfully placed themselves in a portion of the cave that was unmapped with many known risks. They were selfless in their efforts, maintained a calm demeanor, and never gave up on a seemingly impossible rescue. After they determined that recovering the body would be impossible, John was left to rest in the Ed's Push section of the Nutty Putty cave for eternity. The entire cave system was closed off with concrete, never to be explored again. A plaque was placed there to commemorate the life of John Jones. In August of 2005, 5 young adults decided to explore a little-known underwater cave on the side of Y Mountain in Provo, Utah, nicknamed the Cave of Death. They had no idea of the deadly danger waiting inside. In the end, only one of them would return. This is the fatal breakdown of the Gollum Cave tragedy. On Wednesday, August 17th, a group of 5 friends went out for dinner, and they ended up discussing a secret cave on the side of Y Mountain. This mountain is next to the BYU campus, so many local students were aware of the cave's existence. 2 young cavers had fully surveyed Gollum's cave just a year before. It doesn't seem very hospitable at first glance, since it's covered in a foot of water and is only 4 feet tall. It requires those who enter to crouch down to walk along the nearly 100-foot entrance tunnel in a shallow stream. For most hikers, this would not be a fun idea, but for those who know about the secret cave inside, the challenge could be alluring. The secret part of this cavern requires you to lower yourself through an 18 by 24-inch water-filled hole in the ground. Even for those that know what lies on the other side, this daunting moment can halt even the boldest explorers. That night, the group decided to test themselves in this dark and uninviting cave. It was already 2 o'clock in the morning by the time they reached the cave area. They spent some time sitting outside before they ventured into the shallow cave. Jennifer Gilbraith had been through the watery tunnel before, so she had reassured the others that they would be able to hold their breath and swim the 15 feet to the other cave inside. Despite becoming hypothermic and passing out during her previous experience, she was still excited to show her friends this secret place. Blake Donner, Scott McDonald, and Ariel Singer all agreed to give it a try. A 5th friend, Joseph Ferguson, decided to wait outside the main cave until they returned. With only a single flashlight, the 4 made their way to the small opening in the floor of the cave. It was now 4:30 in the morning and pitch black outside. One at a time, they worked up the courage to lower themselves into the narrow passage filled with cold water. Jennifer went first, since she was the only one who had been there before. They watched her head disappear under the water, and a small ripple when she moved through to the other end. The water-filled tunnel was no bigger than a refrigerator door, just 2 feet wide and 4 feet high. One by one, Blake, Scott, and Ariel each dropped in and followed the direction that Jennifer had indicated. There was a rope that was attached to a rock in the main cave. It led through the underwater tunnel and was tied to a piece of wood in the inner cave. With such a small tunnel space, a rope wasn't probably seen as necessary to lead back to the entrance hole. It would seem as if you couldn't miss it. Unfortunately, that is not the case. Brian Lamprey, a previous caver, stated that on his return, he overshot the exit hole and hit a dead end about 4 feet past the hole. In a frantic moment, he realized that a wall of rock surrounded him. He desperately pushed backwards, grasping at the ceiling until he came to the hole. The extra time that this took made him certain that this would end in death. He was extremely lucky to find the hole just a split second before he gasped in a lungful of water. On this day, all 4 had made the short swim to the small cave just 15 feet away. There was room for them to stand and move around just a little. The cave was basically 6.5 feet tall, with a peak in the center around 9 feet. This left about 3 feet of airspace above the water. Joseph sat waiting for his friends to return. He wasn't exactly sure how long they planned to stay in the cave. No clear plan had been established, so he just waited. After nearly an hour, He walked into the cave and looked at the watery hole, but there was no sign of the flashlight or movement of the group. It was now 5:30, and he wasn't sure what to do. He called a few friends who were familiar with the cave, and then eventually the police at 6:25 a.m. When they swam into the inner cave, they were probably nervous and out of breath with hearts racing with adrenaline. As soon as their faces escaped the water, they would have taken a deep breath of relief. Unfortunately, the air in this small space was likely bad air. In caving, this term refers to any air that is not composed of the normal 21% oxygen and 79% mainly nitrogen, with a few other gases at more negligible percentages. Because this cave was stagnant and the water source was closed, the carbon dioxide buildup would be very likely due to several causes. Little by little, as visitors spent time in the inner chamber, the oxygen would be depleted and carbon dioxide would build up. Carbon dioxide is also known to build up in limestone caves due to erosion and seepage from plant decay. There was also evidence that candles were left burning inside, which would have decreased the available oxygen. Having no airflow, carbon dioxide would have settled to a higher concentration at the water level. It would be a subtle evolution over time, and the friends visiting the secret cave would have had no idea about the air condition in the inner chamber. Even if the cavers had only stayed for just a few minutes, their diminished capacity to think, move, and breathe would make the return swim a dangerous endeavor. Once they were in this cave, they may have quickly understood that they couldn't breathe well and that they should return immediately. Because the entrance hole was so small, only one person at a time could traverse the narrow tunnel and pull themselves up the exit hole. Jennifer exited first, but was unable to find the exit hole before running out of breath. She likely had a diminished capacity for breath holding and critical thinking. If the oxygen level was near 10 to 12% in the cave, she would have only had 60 seconds of breath holding before she would pass out. If the rope wasn't in her hand, then finding the opening would have been a frantic effort of feeling along the ceiling of the tunnel. In the cave, the other three would not have known that Jennifer was in a fight for her life. They were left in the dark, suffocating air of the inner cave. After counting for 30 or 60 seconds, Ariel would have been next to exit the secret cave. In a carbon dioxide level of just 2 or 3%, her respiration rate would have doubled. She would have been trying to take deep breaths before sliding her face under the water. Quickly swimming forward with her final burst of energy, she reached ahead to locate the opening. It would have been completely unreal to feel the body of your friend in this narrow, dark tunnel. It was supposed to be a clear passage, because there just wasn't room for two people to push their heads through the tight opening. In a moment of panic, Ariel would have been desperate to get air, and maybe not quite realized that her friend was unconscious and certainly close to death. At this point, Blake and Scott would have been breathing the bad air for several extra minutes in the dark. They each would have been feeling the effects of lower oxygen, higher carbon dioxide, and the panic associated with such an uncomfortable environment to breathe. After waiting a short time, the next friend entered the narrow, water-filled tunnel. Already in a diminished state, Blake would be eager to push through this swim as quickly as possible. He would have been so unnerved to encounter the two girls still floating in the water in front of him. The instant alarm would leave you confused about which way to go. The hole should be just in front of the person in front of you. He may have realized that Ariel wasn't moving, and he needed to push her towards the hole to save her. In a tunnel that was only 2 feet wide and 4 feet deep, moving past anyone, or pushing them forward, would be nearly impossible. The final caver, waiting in the dark inner cave alone, would have been suffering the longest. He was surely eager to get out of this place forever. His journey through the tunnel would be stopped short when he encountered his friends. In such a deficient state, he may have fallen unconscious very quickly. Once the authorities arrived, it was no simple task to try to rescue the friends who might be stuck in the inner cave. They immediately pumped air into the cave to attempt to restore any depleted oxygen levels. At the same time, they pumped out some of the water to create an airspace within the connecting tunnel for rescuers to enter. As soon as the water levels dropped a little, they discovered the body of Jennifer Galbraith floating just inside the tunnel. After pumping for another hour, they found the other 3 friends, Ariel, Blake, and Scott, all together facing towards the exit hole. From the evidence found at the scene, the information provided by Joseph Ferguson, autopsies confirming drowning as the cause of death, and accounts from other explorers who have struggled in the tunnel, we can determine what likely happened. It would be hard to imagine 4 healthy young adults drowning if there weren't some issues with the air. In a span of just 15 feet, 4 friends drowned. They were bold young people, between 18 and 28 years old, in the prime of their lives. After the recovery of their bodies, the cave entrance was filled with concrete to prevent cavers from entering and possibly losing more lives. When 6 men entered a tight cave system to help out with some important mapping work, they thought they would be in for an adventurous day in the deep tunnels of Mossdale Caves. The harsh reality of what they would face is absolutely stunning. This is the fatal breakdown of the Mossdale caving tragedy. In June of 1967, 10 explorers entered the Mossdale Cave system to explore and help clear some of the deeper passages for further mapping. These passages were not well documented by caving standards, but the 2 leaders of the group felt confident in their ability to navigate the group carefully. 26-year-old leader Dave Adamson and his friend Jeff Boireau had explored Mossdale many times before. This cave system was not much of a touring cave. There were very few areas where a person could fully stand. It was mostly grueling crawls or squeezing through wet spaces filled with rocks and mud. That's why after a few hours, 4 of the group members, 2 men and 2 women, turned back as planned. Dave Adamson's fiancée was one of these casual cavers. Morag Forbes was thrilled to be getting married to Dave in less than a month. These adventurers, who only planned a light day of exploring, exited the cave around 5 o'clock. The skies were overcast, but nothing clearly threatening. Dave and Jeff continued deep underground with their 4 caving friends assisting with equipment and tools. Colin Vickers, John Ogden, and Bill Frakes were top cavers. At just 17 years old, Michael Ryan was the youngest member. At this point in the day, the men were starting their crawl through the Far Marathon Passage. This claustrophobic tunnel is the length of 3 football fields, over 900 feet of narrow rock with a light stream of water along the bottom. Far Marathon Passage must be maneuvered in a single direction because it's only 18 inches by 12 inches, barely enough room for an average-sized person to pull themselves along. Imagine crawling in a space not much bigger than your computer screen. Shoulders pinned forward without room to spread your arms or reach back to your waist or legs. Turning around is not an option. Once you squeeze in, you are committed for at least an hour. Near Marathon and Far Marathon are each 900 feet long crawls. There is a small 5-foot area between the two where a caver can partially stand before starting the next section. As the men reach the last section of Far Marathon, there is a further narrowing and a tight squeeze to push yourself through. The goal was to reach this next section of the caving system to clear out passages for further mapping. Around this time, Morag had come back to the entrance to see if the men were done yet, but she didn't see any signs that the cavers were coming out. The rain had started to fall, though nothing too alarming. Underground, they were preparing to clear passages, but noticed the streams had increased and groundwater levels rising just slightly. It would certainly have caught their attention, but may not have registered as a true threat to their mission. At some point, the water levels became disturbing. The men would have heard the increasing volume of flow, as well as felt the rising water at their feet. Knowing they were 3 hours from the entrance, the decision was made to end their work for the day. Dave knew this cave system better than anyone, so they were sure he would know when to lead them out safely. Unfortunately, they had no idea just how much water was coming their way. Morag had returned to the cave entrance a final time at 9 o'clock. She was utterly horrified to see a lake of water collected around the entrance to the cave system. It was fully submerged and completely inaccessible. Her fear and desperation fueled a frantic 3-mile run to get help. The men were moving back up the Far Marathon Passage. Though the water level had risen, they had no choice but to get back to a higher chamber as quickly as possible. This extreme distance in such a confining chamber was likely panic-inducing with such a heavy stream of water coming at them. All their experience told them to move calmly but efficiently to get through this intimidating reality. Sure, they would emerge on the other side in a higher chamber. Young Michael and experienced Jeff were the first 2 to squeeze through the tight starting section of the return. A body could barely fit through portions of this passage. The cavers had to literally squeeze themselves past the rock and pull themselves forward with just their arm strength. Their rubber boots would be towing along the sides to help leverage forward as fast as possible. This time, the water would be coming right at their faces instead of following behind. Jeff Boireau was familiar with the ebb and flow of water in Mossdale. Surely he knew that a swift effort in Far Marathon would get he and Michael safely beyond the risky passage and into the larger chamber above. The other 4 men would have been gathering their gear and preparing for their own entrance into Far Marathon. Now the water flow was becoming more alarming. Dave Adamson was confident that he knew where to wait out the flash flood from the storm. These experienced cavers began their push, with all haste in mind. Jeff and Michael began struggling with the flood of water they were facing in the tight passage. It rose above their hands and then their shoulders. They tried to find the highest crack in the passage to lift their faces as the water rushed into the tunnel. Michael would have asked Jeff what to do, where to go. The amount of water flooding into the narrow passage was only increasing with no safe place to escape. The haunting truth was that there was nothing that they could do. Dave had led the others into this same cramped tunnel, hoping to beat the increasing water flow. As they moved through Far Marathon, they encountered the same devastating reality that their friends had just faced. The water was too high. They turned to elevate their faces above the rising water, seeking the smallest pockets of air, but clearly there was just no escape from this trap. John Ogden was likely the last in the tunnel and heard the desperate cries of his friends to turn back. Realizing that there was no way forward, he pushed with his hands to slide his body backwards, using his feet to lift his body weight. It was only a matter of moments to make a move before he would be fully submerged in water as well. He found a small crack overhead, where he wedged his head and body to gasp for the last moment of air. Maybe the water would stop rising and he would find protection in this small space of air. It was too tight for a person to actually fit, but in the frantic fight for survival, he jammed his body and face up into the narrow slit. Outside the cave, a full rescue effort was beginning. It was clear that the entrance to the cave was completely blocked by a lake of water, but there was still hope that the men had found a safe chamber to wait in until the water levels fell. The rescuers came out in full force. Hundreds of volunteers helped dam off the entrance and install pumps to try to move the water out of the mouth of the cave. This would allow the water levels inside to fall, clearing passages for safe movement. On Sunday afternoon, a full day after the men entered the cave, rescuers were able to make it down to Far Marathon. They shouted a few times, hoping to alert the men that the passage was now clear and they could come down from their high waiting chamber. It wasn't until 2 sets of legs were seen protruding from the ridge of the tunnel that the grim reality was revealed. These 2 bodies were Jeff and Michael, who had lifted their upper bodies into a ridge along the path to try to access the last breaths of air. The reality of the situation was completely devastating to rescuers, who held to a slender thread of hope that these experienced cavers were able to find salvation in an air pocket. One by one, the bodies of 5 men were discovered. John Ogden's body would not be found for another 2 days. He had wedged himself so aggressively into the overhead crack, it took dozens of passes to locate his contorted remains. All 6 men drowned in an inescapable flash flood that filled the entire cavern with water. The cave was closed after this tragedy and remains the final resting place for the 6 men. In 1970, friends of the cavers entered the closed system to move the bodies to an upper chamber. It was renamed the Sanctuary. When a caver makes an incredible discovery, his elation turns to dread as he faces a catastrophic failure deep in the earth. This is the fatal breakdown of the Floyd Collins tragedy. Floyd Collins was feeling electric. He had finally broken through to the long trapped passage he was working on in Sand Cave. A very narrow and corkscrewed tunnel led to this moment of discovery. It was Friday, January 30th, and he had spent weeks pulling out rocks, gravel, and sand to clear enough room for him to try to squeeze through a narrow fissure beneath the passage. Once he pushed himself down through the tiny crack, he slid down the wall for an 8-foot drop to the floor of a large cavern. The entire passage up to this point was basically crawling, squeezing, and inching along. He would surely have to widen the path for others to get in and shore up the crumbling walls and ceiling, but in time, he would be able to make it a paid tourist destination. This was Floyd's dream finally coming true. Unfortunately, the gas lamp he was using for light was starting to run out of fuel. He scrambled back up the wall and pulled his body through the narrow crack, laying down in the angled passage that led back to the rest of the 140 feet of tunnel. When he pushed the lantern forward, the jagged surface caught the base and flipped the lamp. The light was out, and Floyd would have to travel the rest of the way in complete darkness. He laid on his back and used his legs to slide his body across the rough rocks below him. He knew that a careful dance was needed to move through this man-made tunnel of his. In the darkness, he put his foot on the wall and was completely unaware that he was about to make a catastrophic mistake. He pushed his body back toward the slide, and an incredible rumble of rocks and dust filled the tight tunnel. Floyd screamed in pain as he choked on the dusty debris. The crumbling continued as he thrashed in pain, trying to move his left leg from the vise that gripped his ankle. He was struck by the shocking realization that his arms were trapped as tightly as his legs. Floyd was buried in a tunnel that was only 16 inches high and in a wormhole over 140 feet into the earth. It was a shocking pain, but this wasn't the first time Floyd had been trapped in a cave. Just a year before, it had taken 2 days to get out of Crystal Cave, his first big caving discovery. But this time, he was all alone. It was Friday morning, and he wouldn't expect anyone to come looking for him anytime soon. He strained and struggled against the mound that buried him, with absolutely no movement in his left foot. It was trapped under a large rock and a massive pile of debris. His arms were entombed in a jumble of rocks, gravel, and dirt that packed in around his body in the small passage. Floyd took some breaths to relax himself and start the long process of waiting. Eventually, someone would come looking for him and see his jacket and hat hanging outside the cave entrance. The complete darkness and absolute silence made the dripping on his face particularly annoying. A slow drip of water was landing on his face every so often. A smattering of sand escaped the cavity above him and piled on his already impossible position. After hours of laying trapped and straining his muscles against the immovable rocks, he fell asleep for a small escape from this nightmare. When Floyd woke, he was jolted to the reality of his insane position. It was pitch blackness, and his face was wet, with no way to reach up and wipe the water away. He shook his head back and forth in the only movement he had available to him. He screamed off and on, hoping that someone may be coming to check on him. The effort he had put into trying to move his body was exhausting. His fingers scraped against rocks and gravel, but his arms were tightly pressed against his body. The sun had set on Friday, and now morning had come without anyone knowing that Floyd was trapped. He continued his cycles of screaming and struggling against the rock, then passing out from exhaustion. The landowner's teenage son went out to check on Floyd, since he never came back the night before. It wasn't that unusual for Floyd to sleep out in one of the other buildings on the land, or even in the cave itself. Jewel Estes saw Floyd's coat and slid inside the entrance of the cave. He called out to Floyd, and a relieved Floyd called back that he needed help. Jewel was a small kid, but not really a cave guy. He squeezed through one of the tight breakdown areas, but stopped in what is called the turnaround room. He could clearly hear Floyd, but just didn't have the nerve to try to put his head through the insane opening where Floyd's voice was coming from. Floyd understood, and knew that he needed some serious help from his brothers. He sent Jewel away to get some adults who had experience with this kind of rescue. Though he was hungry and thirsty, Floyd was relieved. Someone actually knew where he was, so they would have him out in no time. He knew that more than 24 hours had passed in this position. The water continued to drip intermittently on his face, and the throbbing pain of his foot was a constant presence. He waited a few hours, and one of his brothers finally made it to the cave. He too climbed inside to see what was going on, but he couldn't reach the spot where Floyd was trapped. After more than 100 feet of crawling and squeezing, the limiting hole was staring him in the face. It was just under 9 inches high, the width of a sheet of paper. It was emotionally daunting to even try to poke your head inside, but a true physical impossibility for larger men. They sent for Floyd's younger brother, Homer. At 22 years old, he was small and had a little experience in the caves with Floyd. It was 4 o'clock on Saturday afternoon when Homer arrived and ducked into the cave to help his brother. Homer realized that it had been 30 hours since his brother had had food or water, and was in a truly serious situation if he hadn't been able to free himself yet. Homer squeezed past the first narrow blockade and twisted through the 100 feet of passage leading to the turnaround room. The others had in fact turned around here, but Homer had no choice. His big brother was stuck on the other side of this little hole, so he was going in. Floyd yelled out and instructed Homer on what kind of path was ahead for the next 25 feet. It was a flat, narrow passage with a jagged, rocky bottom. It wasn't an easy crawl, and required Homer to push forward with his toes while scraping along his belly. There was a little lip of rock to perch on above the slide down to Floyd. Homer thought entering the tiny passage was the tough part, but now he looked down to see his brother's face below him. The slide down to him was just 10 feet, but it was narrow. extremely narrow. He came down feet first, but the narrow tunnel would hold his body in the upright position. He would have trouble squatting down or bending over to help Floyd. Nonetheless, Floyd was happy to finally see someone inside his little cave. Homer slid down to help, but found the situation shocking. Floyd was buried up to his chest in rubble. If the slide tunnel wasn't so small, this might not have seemed so daunting, but the nature of the situation limited Homer from just reaching in and raking the rocks out of the tunnel. There was nowhere to move them to, and even if there was, reaching them would require an incredible contortion of his body. Homer brought coffee and sausage to Floyd, and it renewed his vigor in knowing his family was here to save him. Homer moved up and down the shaft, trying to pull Floyd, move rocks to free his arm, and dig out the floor of the shaft so he could squat down to reach into Floyd's tunnel. Because no one else could squeeze through the hole in the turnaround room, Homer was on his own trying to move the earth around Floyd. Each time he pulled away a rock or some dirt, more fell from the exposed, packed earth above the tunnel. Homer was desperate and worked on and off for the next 16 hours, digging, climbing, and sliding back down. He had strained his body in the most uncomfortable squat and reach position to try to make a move that would improve Floyd's situation. It was 8 o'clock Sunday morning when Homer came out of the cave. He needed assistance because he could barely walk from the exertion he had put out. He collapsed and begged someone to go down to help dig his brother out. The crowd had started to build while Homer was underground. Word had spread that Floyd was really trapped this time, and the locals began to gather to see if they could help. Several men had worked their way into the cave tunnels and came to the turnaround room. A few were paralyzed with fear and turned back straight away. It looked like a crumbling hole of boulders with rocks just dangling over the opening. A few of the men put their lights inside the hole and looked at the distance and quality of the tight tunnel. They knew Floyd was currently trapped because of a collapse, so risking it in this hole would be foolish. There were others who were willing to try, but just could not fit in the small opening. Throughout the day on Sunday, the gathering crowd discussed options on how to get Floyd free and went in and out of the cave tunnels without ever passing through the small squeeze. The entire day Sunday, no one was able to reach Floyd to offer him water, food, or comfort. It was now 3 full days of being trapped. It was shocking to Floyd. He was grateful that food and drink were brought in, but his situation was not improved. His arms were still trapped, his foot crushed, and there seemed to be no great plan to get him out. Floyd was feeling weak and cold. His body was laying in a pool of cold, muddy water and jagged rocks. His body temperature was dropping, and he was losing strength each day. He was completely at the mercy of those gathered outside. Homer was drained, but woke to find that no one else was able to reach his brother. He grabbed a bucket and some coffee and made his way back to the cave. His muscles were sore, and his body was damaged from scraping himself through the slide tunnel over and over. His fingers were raw from the desperate struggle to move the pile off his big brother's weakened body. But what could he do? He yelled at the crowd to help him, and they shamefully looked away, knowing they weren't able to make themselves past the ridiculous hole that was the gateway to Floyd's rescue. Homer spent the evening removing rocks from the slide and pile around Floyd. News had traveled that a man had been stuck in a cave for 3 days now, so reporter William Skeets Miller showed up to report on the growing story. Hundreds of people had started showing up just to gawk at the gathering rescue teams, and it had become quite the spectacle. Miller crawled inside the twisting tunnel until he came to the turnaround room. He was shocked by the size of the rocky hole in the corner, barely bigger than a sheet of paper. Luckily, Skeets Miller was a wiry guy, weighing only 117 pounds. He thought if Floyd and Homer had made it, then he probably could too. The jumble of rocks was hardly a tunnel, but Miller pulled his chest and hips through the opening. With some twisting and contortions, he was actually through this tiniest hole. The path on the other side was less than 16 inches high, so he just crawled forward to a small ledge. He could see over the edge was a 10-foot drop to where Floyd was trapped. Even though he found the nerve to push through the tiny squeeze in the turnaround room, he was now faced with a new fear looking down the slide. The pit off the ledge was a narrow drop, at a 30-degree angle. The shaft was narrow and flat, like a chimney. It was enough room to slide his body to the bottom, but he wouldn't be able to move his arms well or bend over to look into Floyd's trap. At this point, he was going to slide down and offer Floyd some coffee while he asked his questions. Floyd's face was covered with a cloth, which he promptly removed. Instantly, Floyd asked that he put it back. The torture of the water droplets had been steady hitting his face for 3 days, and he couldn't take it any longer. Skeets asked his questions and quickly gave Floyd a drink before scrambling back up the shaft to the ledge. Skeets Miller was stunned. He had never seen such a hopeless situation and really couldn't imagine how they would be getting him out. Once he was out, he wrote up his story and sent it out over the wires. He was haunted by what he saw. He had only been down there for 20 minutes and couldn't imagine how Floyd was coping after 75 hours of being trapped in there. Miller was sure that the many experts on site would have Floyd out in no time, so he left it to the professionals. Although there were many experts giving opinions on what to do, very few viable plans were proposed. Professionals from many fields spent hours thinking through the various aspects of air quality, temperature, rock formations, size, and constraints on Floyd's position. With all of their expertise, not one of them was willing or able to squeeze past the tiny hole in the turnaround room. Skeets Miller's trip down had boosted Floyd's spirits, but it was already Monday afternoon, and Homer had been the only person who had actually done anything to possibly free his brother. The news story really took off, and the nation was captivated by the man stuck inside the cave. But all this interest and gawking did nothing to move forward a rescue plan. A local firefighter, Lieutenant Robert Burden, showed up with a plan. He was going to pull Floyd free with ropes and a harness. It was a questionable idea, but honestly nothing else was really working. Homer removing sand and rock by himself would take weeks, and Floyd just didn't have that kind of time. Burden knew that there was a risk that they might even pull Floyd's foot off, but it was an outcome that everyone was willing to face, even Floyd himself. Burden squeezed into the narrow shaft, becoming just the third person to get face-to-face with Floyd. He was astonished at Floyd's predicament. He could barely bend down to reach into the short tunnel where Floyd lay buried. The shaft he was standing in was a chimney, keeping him from fully bending his knees or switching arms from the up or down position. He struggled to wrap the harness around his chest and shoulders because very little of Floyd was fully exposed. Homer had done some work to clear gravel and rocks from around Floyd's upper body, but more rocky debris just continued to tumble down. Once it was set, Burden was already sweating and pained from the difficult position. He was so confident in his plan that he quickly called for Miller and Homer to get into the inner section of the tunnel, up on the ledge, and help him pull. The three men pulled with everything they had, while Floyd screamed out in an incredible amount of pain. Unfortunately, the effort failed to put any real tension on the foot that was trapped, but mostly pressed Floyd's face and chest against the jagged pile of rocks on top of him. He couldn't expand his chest to breathe, and they were literally crushing him. It was 5 o'clock on Monday, February 2nd, and another plan had ended in failure. It seemed impossible that despite all the commotion, effort, and collective expertise up top, not a shred of progress had been made to free Floyd. But that was about to change. At 9 o'clock that night, Floyd's longtime friend Johnny Gerald arrived, sure that Floyd would get out, because he always had before. Just a year earlier, Johnny had helped rescue him from Crystal Cave, where he spent 2 days underground. Johnny was an experienced caver, so when Floyd heard that his old friend was here, he immediately yelled out in relief that Johnny would be able to get him out. Like those before him, Johnny moved through the tunnels of the cave to the turnaround room. He saw the hole in front of him and felt a twinge of nerves. Floyd was a lot smaller than he was. Johnny had always been a bit stocky, but his strength could usually make up for what he lacked in height. In this case, physical strength was no real advantage, but his mental strength was essential. He jammed his body through the tiny hole, dislodging some small rocks as he moved through. The silty dusting that fell all around him was frightening. He belly crawled to the ledge and looked down to see the face of his old friend at the bottom of the narrow shaft. Floyd felt the first moment of joy in days. He was reinvigorated with hope that he might just make it out of this hole, with his foot intact. Johnny tried to slide his body down feet first, but was wedged in the narrow shaft. He adjusted and pushed, but was afraid of getting stuck before helping Floyd at all. It was clear that he just would not fit. For most people, they would accept that they had honestly tried, but the rescue would have to be left to others. But not Johnny. He could hear the desperation in Floyd's voice, and just could not bear to leave. Johnny spent the next 3 hours chipping away rock in the narrow shaft. He chiseled at areas that pinched in together, carefully catching the chips to prevent hitting Floyd down below. By midnight, Johnny was tired, but ready to try again. This time, He was able to slide down the shaft and reach Floyd in the narrow tunnel below. For the next 6 hours, Johnny put his muscle to good use. He filled buckets with rocks and gravel that had buried Floyd's chest. Each effort required him to press his head in an awkward angle to reach his arms into Floyd's tunnel. He pulled and scraped and filled the buckets. They were hauled up and dumped so he could make some room to free Floyd's arms and hopefully get that rock off of his foot. After a grueling 6 hours of squatting and bending, straining every muscle, Johnny had gone as far as he could go. His stocky frame could not reach any farther than Floyd's upper thigh area. It was now early Tuesday morning, and Johnny headed back up to rest for a short time. After Johnny had gone up, Floyd laid alone in his narrow tunnel for the next 12 hours, and it was especially tough. It seemed like so much progress had been made, but the ultimate problem still existed. No matter how hard he pulled or twisted, there was no moving his foot. He was cold and truly afraid. He was lying in a pool of muddy water that was 50 degrees, and the blankets they brought in didn't stop the chill in his bones. Floyd had been stuck for more than 4 full days and hadn't seen the sun since early Friday morning. He was feeling strange and starting to hallucinate about angels and sleeping in his own bed. The time creeped by slowly, and he wondered when someone would be back to help him. And so, he waited. Skeets Miller had continued to file reports on what was happening with Floyd's entrapment, but checked in on Tuesday afternoon to discover that he was still in the same spot, and no plans had come together to get his foot free. The overwhelming problem continued to be that no one was willing to squeeze through the impossible hole that separated Floyd from all the experts. Miller was moved. He realized that he was among a select few who were able to reach Floyd, so he gathered all the cave workers he could and decided to continue with Johnny's work since he was much smaller. At 5:30 on Tuesday evening, he returned to the narrow shaft and used a bucket to continue removing the loose rocks and gravel around Floyd's legs. He had to squeeze into the tunnel with Floyd and press his body to the side for each small handful of rocky earth. Skeets was steadily clearing bucket after bucket until he could get a better look at the offending rock. As this day progressed, some workers had strung a set of lights through the tunnel to reach down to the shaft area. This extra lighting revealed what had not been understood until now. The rock wasn't just heavy and pressing on Floyd's foot, it had slipped down into the crack of the cavern below. This created a wedge which trapped the rock so tightly that neither pushing nor pulling would move it. After a close inspection, Miller went up to talk with the gathered experts. Of all the supplies they had, the only thing that could possibly fit into the tiny hole was a crowbar and a small jack. It wasn't ideal, but it would have to do. Skeets was running purely on adrenaline now and felt a surge of hope that Floyd might be free in just a few hours. He settled back into his awkward perch in the bottom of the shaft. The jack and crowbar were slowly pushed into the end of the tunnel near Floyd's feet. Miller couldn't reach that far, but he pushed with the tips of his fingers to slide the jack in place. He slowly turned the arm to try to raise the platform to the rock's edge. It was painstaking work leaning forward and reaching out with the tips of your fingers. His back spasmed, and he fought every piercing cramp while trying to make it work. It wouldn't reach, so he moved it again, and then a third time, each effort requiring a contortion of his body to barely make a move left or right. He collapsed and heaved with exhaustion. The quiet, calming words of Floyd burned in his mind. Gently, Floyd encouraged, "You can do it, fella. I believe in you, fella." Miller could not give up on this man. He called for some wooden blocks and went through a series of positioning and repositioning, trying to lift the rock even a tiny bit. At one point, the jack had a nice grip on the rock's edge and each tiny quarter turn was holding. Skeets turned a little and held it, then turned some more, sensing that the rock was actually starting to lift. Then, the whole contraption collapsed with a quiet clank. He tried again, and again, each time making some small adjustment, but never making any progress on moving the rock. At 1 a.m., after 8 long hours of trying, he collapsed with exhaustion. Both mentally and physically, he was completely beat. He wrapped the last light bulb in the string around Floyd's neck for warmth and retreated to the surface. He just wanted to cry from exhaustion, anger, and pity. It was now the start of a new day, Wednesday, February 4th. Some men from the Kentucky Rock and Asphalt Company went in to take a look at the stability of the tunnels. Their work to shore up the front section of the cave really helped open up the pathways and make it passable for most of the rescuers' attempts. The problem was that as you climbed deeper into the cave, the walls and ceiling were sagging and bulging, starting to literally close in on the pathway. Workers in the turnaround room were trying to figure out if they could widen the tiny hole, when a frightening rumble was heard from within. The workers informed the team above the devastating news that there had been a cave-in. The entire tunnel was unstable, and anyone going inside would be risking their own life. Johnny Gerald again stood up and offered to go inside. He slowly moved through the tight passages and listened for any additional rockfalls. He got to the area of the cave-in and did what only Johnny could do. He got to work moving the rocks. It seemed like a hopeless task, with obstacle after obstacle. One rock at a time was cautiously pulled away, careful not to disturb the rocky gravel perched just above his own head. This effort took more than 8 hours, hunching and laying, trying to reach his arms in a painfully exhausting overhead reach. Just when he didn't think he could move anymore, he was able to secure a small opening that revealed the light still glowing inside. Floyd was still communicating, though he seemed to be fading after nearly 6 days of being trapped. Johnny knew that he would have to get a wild burst of adrenaline to pull these final rocks away and then make an attempt to save his friend. It was 10:30 at night now, and finally the path was opened once again. Johnny went out to collect tools to chisel away at the rock on Floyd's foot. He gathered the men, who would be part of the bucket brigade, to move the final rocks and gravel from around Floyd's legs. They were full of confidence that this would somehow be the successful effort to get Floyd out alive. They crawled through to the turnaround room and were stunned by what they saw. The ceiling had poured into the narrow passage leading down to Floyd. The cave-in was bigger and heavier than before, with the only path now being swamped in a sea of rocks, gravel, mud, and debris. The melting snow had swelled the walls and ceiling, and the weight just couldn't be held back. Johnny yelled out to Floyd, and he returned the call with a yell of his own. He was alive, and Johnny could not just leave him there. The walls seemed to be heaving and breathing, ready to suffocate him at any moment. The other men backed out of this area, back to the reinforced entrance. Johnny was alone, digging in the pile of dirt, ragged and desperate to have something go his way. It was sickening. If he turned and left, he would essentially be abandoning his friend's only chance at rescue. He scooped out the new debris in the hole, and it just refilled from an endless source above him. Larger rocks started tumbling down the mound, and Johnny was suffering. He filled his bucket and heard new rumblings. More silted rain came down on his head, face, and back. It was truly a death trap. Johnny resigned himself to the hardest decision of his life, but he had a family of his own. He retreated to the entrance, while new piles of gravel and rock accumulated in the path. He sat down and cried. He was done. It was now clear that although Floyd was still alive inside the tight tunnel, climbing in to rescue him would not be survivable. The governor brought in the National Guard, and the state finally took control of the rescue effort, with a plan to dig a hole straight down to Floyd's location. This would give them a chance to excavate around him and bring him up to the surface through a reinforced shaft. On Thursday, February 5th, the 7th day of his entrapment, digging began. They were quite optimistic, expecting to reach Floyd within 30 hours. They needed to dig a shaft down 55 feet, then dig laterally to reach the narrow passage leading to Floyd. The enthusiasm waned as hours turned into days, and progress slowed to a crawl. There were problems with equipment, collapses, hard soil, heavy rains, and personnel disputes. This 30-hour dig stretched over the next 12 days. Yes, 12 full days of digging. During this time, there were news stories and radio serials about Floyd. There was a military inquest to see what went wrong in the initial rescue effort. There were professionals coming and going with dozens of ideas on how to get to Floyd faster. As they got closer and closer, it was thought that they heard coughing deep in the shaft, keeping hopes alive that Floyd may still be living. He had a trickle of water, so it was possible for him to survive. The light bulb that had been hung around his neck was being monitored for changes in the electrical pulse. It was thought that there was some interference with the electricity each time Floyd breathed. For days, they were monitoring the scratchy interference, coming through nearly 20 times a minute. This bulb was helping to keep Floyd a bit warmer as well. On Friday, February 13th, the bulb that had been keeping Floyd warm burnt out. There was no more signal on the line of any kind. It was 2 full weeks that Floyd had been trapped and suffering, an astonishing amount of time under such a mental and physical nightmare. The shaft diggers continued on until Monday, February 16th, when they finally broke through the tunnel and entered the cave shaft. The first man through the tunnel was only a few feet from Floyd. It was quickly determined that Floyd was dead. The coroner came down and formally made a determination of death. He stated that Floyd had lived for around 14 days trapped in the tunnel. He appeared to have only been dead for 3 days. It was stunning. After the final cave-in, Floyd had just laid alone in the cave, with only a trickle of water and the use of one arm, for 9 days, before he died. Floyd was an eager and talented cave explorer, in a time when it would have meant everything to his family if he could discover a touring cave. He dedicated 12 hours a day, for weeks, trying to find that one special place he could commercialize. In the end, he found exactly what he was looking for, because Sand Cave became a household name, along with Floyd Collins. The nation mourned his death and was petrified by the way it lingered on in a painful and drawn-out manner. The passion of his family, friends, and even strangers to help Floyd escape was truly palpable. Their heroic efforts in climbing down into a nightmarish squeeze of rocks and earth should be remembered along with Floyd's life and passion. Floyd's body was moved to his family farm a few months later and buried near his own crystal cave. Later, when the cave was acquired by the National Park Service, he was interred in the Mammoth Cave Baptist Cemetery.